Hi, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I hope you all had a chance to see the performance on the Henry J. Lear stage. I know that I have been waiting all week to see a performance on the Henry J. Lear stage. It's a pretty exciting day for us. And now we're really fortunate today to be joined by author, journalist, dance raconteur, former choreographer, former dancer Wendy Perrin today to talk about her new book, which came out in the fall. But as we know, we were all locked down in our homes, so maybe you didn't know. It's called The Grand Union: Accidental Anarchists of Downtown Dance, 1970 to 76. Welcome, Wendy Perrin, please.
Thank you, Melanie.
So I do know that books take a long time from the idea of when you first conceive it to when it actually gets to the thing that you get to hold in your hand. So how long were you working on this text?
It's when I first saw the videos of the Grand Union, 40 years later, and I was so excited by it and realized that it was as amazing as I remembered it to be. And I was telling my husband about how excited I was, and he said, "I think you need to write a book about this." And so I don't know when that was. I can't date what year that
Sure.
was. But it was a couple of years of interviewing people, and I think there was about a year and a half of the most peak, where every day I had to work on the book. And then there's probably another year and a half where I had to verify the quotes and do all that extra stuff.
Yeah. So maybe we can
Before I turned in, and then
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
let me just say, with an academic press, your whole manuscript goes to outside readers.
Right.
So that takes at least 6 months. So that was added to it, and then it's 6 months of arguing about the cover and the index,
Yes,
and
yes.
on and on.
Yeah. There's the sort of creative part, and there's a whole tedium that accompanies
The tedium,
the getting it
absolutely.
into this form itself. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about the organization of it. As I was reading through it this week, I was really fascinated by the big ideas, and then there's what you call interludes
Right.
in between the
Right.
chapters. Could you maybe talk about that?
Well, the interludes are a chance for other people to have voices, or for me to have something like one of the interludes is called Musings on Nothingness. So some of the ideas, like who considers what nothing when they're watching a performance, I started thinking of the different people who said things about nothing, and it came from Clive Barnes saw a performance of Yvonne Rainer, and he said, first he said, "Disaster has hit Judson Church." And then he said, "No, nothing has hit Judson Church." And that actual performance turned out to be the performance of Trio A, which is now an
It's
acknowledged
iconic.
iconic dance of the period. But when Clive Barnes first saw it, he called it nothing. So that started me thinking, like, who calls something nothing? What are they looking for when they see nothing? So a lot of critics would watch Grand Union and they'd say nothing is happening.
Yeah.
But maybe they're watching over there and someone over there sees something happening.
It also actually makes me think about how a critic has to figure out how to engage with work that they don't quite understand. And I think within that, there's sometimes this tension with not wanting to let on that you don't know what you're looking at.
Yeah. And if it's not your, as a critic, if it's not your taste, can you still talk about it? Can
Yeah.
you still write about it? So there were some. Grand Union was different from anything else being performed because it was sort of rambling improvisation. That's not how I saw it. I saw it as incredibly exciting because of who the people were and how they were interacting with each other. But a lot of people would just see it as nothing. And I think some critics tried to get into it, even though they didn't like this sort of non-professional thing.
Yeah.
But
Whatever that means.
yeah, but that non-professional thing was also part of a zeitgeist.
Yes.
It was part of a kind of movement to break down what you expect when you go to theater or what you expect when you go to a gallery. So they were really, the subterranean thing was they were breaking down a lot of expectations.
So I know that this is a very educated audience who's really familiar with a lot of things, but I think it might be helpful to have you distinguish between Judson Church and Grand Union, because I think the way a lot of dance history gets taught, these things get conflated.
Yes.
And I recognize there's overlap between the participants, but if you could sort of give us that distinction and tell us why Grand Union gets its own book.
Yeah. Well, Judson Dance Theater was basically from 1962 to 64, and it was a group of people who were studying with Robert Dunn, who was a disciple of John Cage. So it was all Cage influence, and John Cage influenced not just musicians, but theater people and visual art people and dance people. And when this group of people, and the first 5 people in Robert Dunn's class included Yvonne Rainer, Simone Forti, and Steve Paxton. And when they wanted to perform, so there are a lot of ideas coming out of this John Cage influenced, Zen influenced philosophy that was very open and very experimental. And they were showing a lot of things. They were in the same building as they were in the Merce Cunningham studio, which was in the same building as Living Theater. So they were showing their work at Living Theater, which was very small. They wanted to show work at a larger place. So they went to the 92nd Street Y, which was at that time was the place for modern dance. It was where Martha Graham, Doris Humphrey, Pearl Primus, Pearl Lang, Alvin Ailey were all performing at Eurico at the 92nd Street Y. They were turned down. This group of people doing walking dances and running dances and talking dances were turned down by the Y, which was the only place to do modern dance. So it was like a salon de refusés. They didn't know where to go. Where do you go where you get an audience for dance? They went to Judson Memorial Church, which already had a poets gallery and an arts gallery. Klaus Oldenburg was already showing work at Judson Gallery, and Yvonne Rainer knew this. She said, "Let's go there." And the Reverend Al Carmine said, "Okay, you can do what you do it in the basement." And after a year, the church staff had a vote, and they said, "Oh, you can do it in the sanctuary." So that was Judson Dance Theater, which involved Lucinda Childs, Trisha Brown, Rudy Perez, a lot of different people, and it really only lasted about 2 years. But they blew open a lot of ideas, like where could you dance? Do you have to dance in a theater? Do you have to dance with music? Do you have to dance in an ABA sort of thematic formula? All of these things were questioned by Judson Dance Theater. So then in the mid-'60s, they sort of went their different ways. Trisha Brown did her own work. Yvonne Rainer did her own work. They weren't a collective so much anymore. And Yvonne was doing, in 1969, she was doing a piece called Continuous Project Alter Daily, which was this everyday change kind of thing. And David Gordon was in it, and Steve Paxton was in it. Barbara Dilley was in it, who, by the way, was a student here in 1956. And it came out of their separate works. But this work by Yvonne Rainer, she decided she didn't want to be the leader anymore. And she said, "This is a great group. You're all so talented and interesting and amazing. Why don't you figure out what you can do together and I'll just pull out?" And so this was a few years after the end of Judson Dance Theater. And they tried to rehearse together. They tried to say, like, Barbara said, "Oh, let's do these circular things." And David Gordon said, "Oh, let's do lean against thing. We'll do sleepwalking." And Steve Paxton said, "Let's do some tumbling." And they were all like, "No, I don't want to do what you're telling me to do." And so, well, we want to dance together. What are we going to do? Improvise? So that's what they did. And then that became Grand Union, which which some of us know as a big grocery store. But we don't talk about the supermarket because young people have never heard of a Grand Union. And so that's why I could call my book The Grand Union.
Okay, all right. So it's really interesting to me how pervasive the, I guess mostly compositional theories, but overall aesthetic is in terms of how it permeated through academia, because it's not possible that everyone who ended up teaching this stuff studied with those people, yet someone seems to know somebody who studied with those people, because it ends up becoming the foundation for a lot of how dance composition is taught in higher education, and I'm wondering, do you have any thoughts on like how it sort of
Disseminated, how it's spread out.
because I'm the generation that's behind the generation that studied with those people, right?
Right,
And so,
right.
and everyone seems to have a story, but everyone couldn't have been there. It's like everyone saying they were at Woodstock. Everyone was not there. So
Right.
how does that happen?
Right.
You know?
Well, I think there was, I mean, Barbara Dilley, Tricia Brown, Yvonne Rainer, Steve Paxton, who is the father of contact improvisation, they did workshops all over the place. And this was, the nucleus was Soho, the nucleus of a place. And when I wrote the book, I was basically saying, only at this time and place could this have happened. This was the synergy between the people in Grand Union was amazing, and that's what made it work, because you couldn't just get any 6 or 9 people together and go, oh, we'll improvise,
Sure. Yeah.
and have an audience. But I think it's generational. You know, I think there are people I see who do Tricia Brown type movement, and they've never studied with Tricia or with anyone who danced with her, and they don't even know what they're doing is Tricia Brown movement. But I think it gets diluted as it goes, kind of. But I agree with you that the postmodern aesthetic or range of things is very big in colleges now, where it used to be the Louis Horst thing, which was the ABA, very clear thematic, and it took years to blow that away. And I think in a lot of schools, both are being taught, depending on the faculty.
Yeah. So, you know, in reading through the table of contents, I was really struck by the recent losses that we've had and how those folks show up in the book. You dedicate it to Sally Baines, who we recently lost, and then Nancy Stark Smith passed away, and Anna Halpern just passed away.
And Mary Overly is another one.
And Mary Overly.
Yeah,
and so,
yeah.
it just seems really timely that you've captured this information at this time. I'm wondering if you could particularly talk a little bit about Nancy Stark Smith, who I feel among dancers is fairly well known, but maybe a little lesser known to people who aren't doing a daily improvisatory practice.
And do you know who Nancy Stark Smith is? A lot. If you don't, raise your hand. So when I started to say Steve Paxton was kind of the father of contact improvisation, it was during a Grand Union residency at Oberlin College where he decided to teach a men's workshop and teach men how to tumble and fall and be soft when they fall, and they don't have to be like this kind of, Bolshoi bravura man. But he wanted it specifically for men. Nancy Stark Smith was a student at Oberlin at that time, and she said to him, if you ever do this for women, could you please let me know? And that was the beginning of contact improvisation, when there were women and men, and it was her. She was a very athletic kind of dancer. And then it was the men and the women, together, first with mats and then without mats. But the way that Steve Paxton worked in this touching, weight-bearing thing came out of Grand Union, specifically out of duets he did with Douglas Dunn in Grand Union. So there was this, each of them got to experiment in Grand Union with their own thing. Barbara Dilley experimented with her contemplative dance practice in Grand Union, and that's what she taught at Naropa for years.
And, in describing that, I guess the point I want to make is it's interesting how all of these distinctive aesthetics are living under this umbrella of what we're calling Grand Union. When I think of Nancy Stark Smith, I don't conflate what Anna Halpern did with what Nancy Stark Smith did. And so can you maybe talk about Anna Halpern in the context of Grand Union, and then how that sort of plays out into...
Well, so in the summer of 1960, Anna Halpern she would do these summer workshops in California. And Anna Halpern was someone who, she would have loved this deck.
Yes.
She danced outdoor. She insisted on dancing outdoors and interacting with nature. That was her idea of how to get out of the proscenium stage, get out of modern dance training into a more natural body. And Simone Forti worked with her for years, but in the summer of 1960, Yvonne Rainer came and studied with her. Tricia Brown came and studied with her, and Simone was already there. June Ekman, who is a somatics practice person, was there. So her influence came through those people, and mainly Simone Forti, who really, I feel like, carried in her body everything about Anna Halpern and nature to New York City, where she was confronted with sidewalks and big buildings.
Yeah.
And she was like, let me out of here, I want to go back to California. And she made work that made sense for her in New York City. And she influenced Yvonne Rainer and Steve Paxton and Trisha Brown, even though Steve had never danced with Anna Halpern, but Steve was in Simone Forti's first dance constructions. So everyone was questioning, how you make a dance kind of thing. Then Nancy Stark Smith was later, and so when they would go on these Grand Union things where maybe Trisha and Steve would have their own constellations with them, Nancy Stark Smith would be with the Steve constellation.
Mm-hmm.
So she could be sometimes sharing a program with. She would watch Grand Union so much, and she had so many thoughts, and I was so lucky to interview her before she died. She had so much to say about her passion for. She would watch how things developed out of nothing, and she would try to study that, like, how did that happen? And it was all so intuitive, and so that gave her a lot to gnaw on,
Yeah.
besides the tumbling and the hurling and all that.
Yeah. Can you talk to the audience about the small dance?
Oh, the small. I can do the small dance
Sure,
with the thing
sure.
in my
I
pocket.
think so. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and she learned this at Oberlin. This is one of the things that Steve Paxton gave, and you can do it while you're sitting down. But it's you close your eyes and you feel the imbalances, how you're shifting, and being aware, calling it a dance, calling this doing nothing a dance. There's nothing again. That's where nothing comes in. Now you call the doing nothing a dance, and you're feeling it. And it's the opposite of presentational dance.
Mm-hmm.
It's the opposite of I'm performing for you. And Steve Paxton was a very internal kind of person, and you needed to feel that internalness to start going with someone, to start feeling their weight.
Yeah. Yeah, that generation that precedes them, there's so much heroicism in the way that they portray their dancing, and I don't think it's fair to say that the dancers of this era were ego-less, but I think they're in the dancing. There is this desire to sort of not lead with this sense of conquering
Yeah.
the dancing. Is that a fair way to say it?
Yeah, or mastering. Yeah. It was also in the basement of Judson Church, whether they were the basement or the sanctuary, it's a small space. And in order to connect with people, you don't need to go big. You can just do small. And somatic practice began at that time too. So if you don't need to tighten your muscles to just extend into space, you can soften. You can soften the muscles. So that kind of experimentation grew up at the same time as somatic practice. A lot with Elaine Summers.
So I really appreciated the attention to Barbara Dilley and Nancy Lewis because, in my experience, usually it sort of goes like this: Trisha Brown, Yvonne Rainer, and then Steve Paxton, and then maybe Simone Forti, and then like some other people, and then a whole bunch of people who never get discussed at all.
Right.
And unless you're doing some really deep digging into an archive of some sort, or there's names that you may never come across, and even if you do, they might be just among a list of names that are sort of put together. And so I would love to hear more about these people. I'd love for you to share more about these two individuals. So maybe start with Barbara Dilley.
Yeah, as I said, Barbara Dilley, and I just, she was just on Facebook saying, when I posted that I'm doing this, she said, I was a student at Jacob's Pillow in 1956. I studied flamenco there, and I lived in Ballet Alley, which I guess, I don't know if they still call it Ballet Alley.
Pam, do you know what Ballet Alley is? Or Norton? It's over here?
It was a cabin that was right over
Oh, it was a
okay.
particular cabin. So she was there in 1956 when she was becoming a dancer. She also danced with Merce Cunningham. Beautiful dancer. People remember her if you've ever seen the film of of rainforest, and and she's sitting, and Merce is standing behind her, and she just brings an arm up like this, and she sort of crawls around Merce, and it's like she was the only dancer with Merce who had the privilege to be soft and sensuous. And that was just her nature, so that's the way she was. She also did happenings with Klaus Oldenburg. She would do these things. She was pregnant and wore a pink tutu or something. She would do these wild things. She did not choreograph at Judson, and she wasn't in Robert Dunn's class, but she was in Merce Cunningham's company. And when they did there's a work called Story in Merce Cunningham's company that was improvisational in terms of what you would put on and wear, and she played around with that and caused a fuss in Japan because she was nude for 5 seconds on stage. But she was the one who egged Yvonne Rainer on. And she was the one who said, Yvonne, why don't you give the dancers more, why don't you give us more options? Let us decide some things. So she was a big influence in that way.
And,
And Nancy Lewis.
Yeah.
Nancy Lewis went to Juilliard. She was the only Juilliard-trained dancer among Grand Union. Her name is never mentioned when postmodernism is mentioned.
Ever, yeah.
Ever,
Yeah.
right? Well, actually, she was called Nancy Green for a long time. Okay. These women who change their names when they get married, it's so confusing. Barbara Dilley was Barbara Lloyd for a while. Nancy Lewis was and by the way, her cousin is Juliette Lewis. The actress.
Yeah, okay.
No, not cousin, niece, sorry. She was Nancy Lewis Green Peck. But she was a gorgeous dancer. And she wasn't like Steve, who was kind of philosophical, and Douglas Dunn, who was kind of wildly nervous. I thought it was more tap dancers.
Just dancing on the gravel.
Yeah. But Nancy was a gorgeous dancer. And for people who would go to see Grand Union and they felt like they were just seeing people sort of walk around and thinking, they could see Nancy dance, and she saved it for them, for a lot of people. But she didn't continue in the field, really, which is part of the reason you don't hear her name.
Why do you think that, and I should say I neglected to name David Gordon in that list that I just gave, but why do you think that there's so many more women than men in terms of the names that we know?
Oh, that we know?
Yeah.
In postmodern dance?
Yeah, sure.
Why do you think?
I don't know. I mean, I wasn't there. I don't know. But, I was 2 during when this was happening. But I'm just curious because, obviously we know that there's an imbalance between, if we're looking at gender as a binary, between men and women in dance. So that we know that to be true. But we also know that, like, historically, the people who tend to get have leadership tend to be men, right? The people who are running the companies, and so it's really curious to me that when we go through this list of names, it's overwhelmingly women who are the thought leaders within this collective. Now, I've met David Gordon, so I know certainly he was someone who was probably, very bold and brash in the way that he was communicating, but is outnumbered, frankly, by a lot of women.
Well, that was true in modern dance, too, when you look at Martha Graham and Doris Humphrey. Yes, there was Ted Shawn, who was a leader, but there, a lot of the people who came after him were women.
You know what, though? I don't know that I think of it that way. I think that, yes, that particular, like, pioneer generation, that Martha Graham, Doris Humphrey, but then the people after them, Paul Taylor, Merce Cunningham, like, it's just a bunch of men, right?
Yeah.
Like, again and again and again.
Murray
and again.
Lewis, Alan Nicolai.
And so it's really curious that the people who were really inspired at a most experimental time, coming after that first wave of postmodernists, being Alan Nicolai and Merce Cunningham, that it's the women who are running with it, and it's the women whose work is the work that we know the most.
Well, Yvonne Rainer was a huge influence. I mean, she was just so strong. She just did what she did, and she rebelled against all the status quo. And it was a period of, it was the second wave of feminism. And for my generation, it was like Yvonne Rainer, Trisha Brown, Meredith Monk, and Twyla Tharp were just huge. And then on the other side of town, Judith Jamison. So there were, I think women have always been strong, but I think Yvonne was a big influence, and Anna Halpern,
Yeah. I appreciate that you just mentioned the other side of town, because one of the interludes that fascinated me was the Diane McIntyre one, who was not a part of this collective, but as you are really clear in the book, you talk about that she was doing an improvisatory practice that was grounded in jazz concurrent to what was going on. And so I would be remiss if I just didn't, note that this, what we're talking about, is an overwhelmingly white, collective
absolutely.
of people. And
Yeah.
so I'm wondering, in talking to Diane, what are maybe some things you learned about what was going on concurrently that you weren't experiencing because you were so steeped in this other scene?
Yeah, I mean, I was steeped in the Soho scene, which was very white. And Diane McIntyre and I are just about the same age. And we had a similar experience in that she worked with Judy Dunn and Bill Dixon in Ohio State University. I worked with them at Bennington College, like a year after she did. I learned so much about musicians doing jazz improvisation from her. Diane McIntyre, who's so lauded in the dance world. I mean, she's so looked up to as a strong woman dancer, but she never said that she was improvising. She would use improvisation, but she would never say it because she thought she'd be diminished for it. She thought, and this is why I included her, because there was a conversation at Bill T. Jones's house, and she said, the only reason Grand Union was famous is because they were white. And also saying the only reason they got away with doing improvisation is because they were white. And then I thought, I have to talk to Diane about this, because I know that both Anna Halpern and Trisha Brown felt like no one wants us to improvise. That they also felt like improvisation was being put down, that it was not respected in white or black or any world. And I remember Bill T. Jones said to Diane, what, you mean you couldn't say that improvisation that black people have been doing for decades and decades, you couldn't say that you were doing it? And so there was she felt not only a black-white difference in terms of improvisation, but a music and dance difference. That for the musicians, I think she said, and I think I quoted her in that, that's how you prove your mettle, by improvising, for a musician.
Yes.
For a dancer, you're lazy if you improvise. So there was and Grand Union did a lot to go against that. And even though a lot of people would say you're doing nothing, you're lazy, but there were moments in Grand Union that were undeniably just great. So there were all these differences happening. And when she told me that with musicians, they would audio tape their improvisations, and then the younger generation would copy them. Would like, this is like the scale, this is like great music. You would never have that in the dance world. You would never have someone saying, oh, here's Trisha Brown improvising, you must study it. So I think Diane was right that improvisation was looked down upon, and that was something that comes from a historical thing of Louis Horst saying, and Jack Moore told me this. We both studied with Jack Moore, that and he was an assistant to Louis Horst, who was the dance composition teacher in the first 5 decades of modern dance. And he would say, we have to show that modern dance is a real art. We don't want people thinking we're just groveling on the floor. We don't want people to think that modern dancers, all they do is roll on the floor. So there has to be form, A, B, A. And so that's how that structure got to be like the golden structure of modern dance. And when Trisha Brown and Yvonne came along, it was like, we're going to blow this ABA thing apart.
Yeah. Steve Packett said, I'm going to actually roll on the floor right now.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
On purpose.
Yeah. And the thing is, when Steve Paxton rolls on the floor, it's pretty darn interesting.
Right. I think now might be a good time to take some questions from the audience. What are you curious about?
Well, I want to say one more person.
Sure,
You said Nancy Lewis is hardly ever mentioned.
Yeah.
Okay, another person is Lincoln Scott.
I've never heard of Lincoln Scott.
Well, there's certain parts of the book where I mention him. So Lincoln Scott was an African American who had studied with people who had been with Anna Halpern on the West Coast. And he came to New York, and he was friends with Steve Paxton, and he sort of drifted toward Grand Union. He was one of the first members of Grand Union. And even Gus Solomons.
I was going to say Gus Solomons is the one that was coming to mind.
Yeah, even Gus Solomons, when I did my first Zoom thing and I showed a video with Lincoln Scott in it, and Gus Solomons is older than us, and he said, I didn't know there was a black person in Grand Union. It was like, Wendy, how come you didn't tell me this years ago? There was a black person in Grand Union. And the thing is that Lincoln Scott only lasted about the first year. And then he kind of drifted away. But he was an interesting dancer. He was also younger than everyone else in the group. He was more my age. And so he's almost 10 years younger than everyone else in the group. So you would watch Grand Union, you'd wonder whether this person was in it or out of it. He was not as confident as the others. I mean, I don't know where Barbara Dilley got her chutzpah to walk into this group of improvisers and just be able to do it. But he didn't have that, although he's in the Oberlin video, and he does beautifully. And it was an interesting choice for him, but partly because he came from the Anna Halpern aesthetic. Most young black dancers at that time would go straight to Ailey or Broadway, but he wanted to be downtown, and that was a very striated time when black dancers were not interested at all in what was going on in Judson. They were Alvin Ailey had just started, and within 2 years of starting, Alvin Ailey was getting international tours. So there was no reason a black dancer would go wander into these people who were just walking and eating lunch on stage. So there was such a aesthetic difference.
Going back to your earlier comment about downtown, I'm not sure that there is a uptown downtown anymore in terms of. I'm not sure. I don't really know if I believe in that. That
Strong
line.
divide.
But clearly back then there were distinct.
Yeah.
It was very distinct in that way in terms of the kind of dance you would do in one locale versus the other.
And again, Gus Solomons is the person who has the clearest memory and vision of that, and why certain things. Miguel Gutierrez wrote this essay called "Does Abstraction Belong to White People?" And Grand Union was seen as sort of abstract, but they're
it's a great essay, by the way. I encourage everyone to read that. I assign it to my students. All the time.
Me too.
So questions that you have as we're talking about this great book. Let me give you the title one more time. The Grand Union, Accidental Anarchists of Downtown Dance, 1970 to 1976. What's coming up for you, or what's something that maybe we can define more for you?
I
Norton.
have a very pillow-centric question, but I wonder if you could say something about the podcast that you...
Oh,
Yeah.
yes.
I wrote, I think I just tweeted this, that this group was too anarchistic for Jacob's Pillow at the time, in the 70s. There's no way that Ted Shawn was going to invite Grand Union here to the Pillow. And this was before the Duke Theater, which I want to talk about in a minute. But since then, the Pillow has recognized 4 of the main people as artists and came in and were guests, and that's David Gordon, Trisha Brown, who's been here a lot, and whom I danced with, by the way, in the 70s. And Yvonne Rainer has been here doing some hilarious stuff. And Steve Paxton has been here, right? So since then, they've been here. And Norton has this great series of podcasts, and I was able to mine those talks and create a podcast, which you'll see. It's the most recent podcast if you go to if you go to the Pillow website and it says engage and learn.
Yeah, so the title of the podcast is called Pillow Voices Dances Through Time, I believe. And there are many, many episodes. They're all great. I have two. And you can find it in any of your podcatchers, wherever you're getting your regular podcasts, Apple or Stitcher or any of those things. But yeah, the latest episode is from Wendy.
Yeah, so that was really a pleasure for me to go in and hear those voices again. And Tricia, who died in 2017, of course, it was really emotional for me to, hear her voice and see her in action too. And their work, although Tricia would separate, and Tricia probably wouldn't have even wanted me to do this book because she so much wanted to get out of Grand Union and do her own work and start her own new company, which I was actually part of. But they all wanted to do their own thing and not really talk about Grand Union that much. But one thing that I want to emphasize is it was leaderless. It was an experiment in a true collective where no one was the leader. It didn't last for more than 6 years because when nobody's the leader, you can't get anything done, really. Things don't get talked about and don't get solved, don't get confronted, don't get solved. But for those 6 years, there was this incredible improvisation group. And some of my colleagues were actually, they called themselves groupies. They would say, and Mary Overly was one of them, when Grand Union was performing, I would stop everything. I would drop everything and go to see them. They were so charismatic. And one critic said that Barbara Dilley and Steve Paxton were like Paul Newman and, God, I forget the woman's name. No, not his wife, but a more glamorous, not Tuesday Weld or someone like that. They were like movie stars. For us in Soho, this group was like movie stars. And
How did they respond to being movie stars?
they were like,
Because that's always been my impression of Yvonne Rainer, is that she had like zero interest in being a rock star.
Oh,
in that
absolutely,
way,
yeah. No, they didn't. And Steve was so like withdrawn. But David Gordon had his own way of
Yes.
getting his stuff out there,
Yeah.
Well, because David Gordon was very influenced by vaudeville. And for him, it was like Showtime. And Tricia was more like, I'm doing this movement. But she was verbally incredible. They also spoke as they danced. So they were all just brilliant. And for me to describe in words what their brilliance was one of the biggest challenges I've ever had. And I consider choreographing actually a huge challenge. Next to that's the biggest challenge, I think. But next to that, putting into words what people call magical, for lack of a better term. What is it that makes this synergy of Grand Union like, oh my God, I can't believe it. I'd watch the videos over and over and over and just wait for that one part where he did this to her, or she threw out the key and he ate it with his mouth, or whatever it was, and it was so madcap, and yet they were so tuned into each other. They were just tuned into each other. And when I wrote the book, as I said, I was thinking, it's just this time and place. This could never happen again.
Yeah.
The stars would never be aligned again.
I think that's an important point you made, though, about the idea that it's leaderless, because I think if the intent is that you're trying to stay in this place of experimentation and inspiration, there's a certain point where that's not sustainable anymore. It's going to burn itself out. And
Yeah.
that's exactly what the point of it was. And so the short-term lifespan of it is natural and what needed to happen so that there could then be a Trisha Brown dance company, or Yvonne Rainer could begin to make films, or
Yeah.
David Gordon can continue to make work over a 40, 50-year period.
It's true. It enabled, the death of Grand Union enabled the birth of many other things. But I still maintain that David Gordon, in his own work, was never as funny as he was in Grand Union. That Trisha was never as witty as she was in Grand Union. That Yvonne Rainer was never as surrendering to her emotions as she was in Grand Union. I mean, that's the way I see it. But what I was going to say about it's only time and place. But then I saw a video of an improvisation between three people that was in Chicago. And it was Ishmael Houston Jones, Ralph Lemon, and B.B. Miller.
Yeah.
And they did a 3-person improvisation that so reminded me of Grand Union because they were so tuned into each other. And Ralph is very aware of Grand Union. He's very aware of how they chose music. He had all his records on the floor during this thing and we'll just put a record on by chance. And this is what Grand Union did. The music was just by chance. That was the John Cage influence. Not that he would have liked the music they chose because it was popular music, but it was like, someone put the music on and then we're going to dance to it. It was really taking that chance thing to another level.
Yeah.
Faith and chance.
There's a
yeah.
question over here.
I wanted to ask you about that exact thing, Wendy. Because that came through John Cage and his interest in randomness and the Taoist kind of philosophy was behind that, wasn't it?
Yeah, sort of whatever is the nature of the thing itself, kind of. And
And surrendering to what's just happening.
to what's surrendering to it. So the music turns on and you surrender to it. Actually, part of the conflicts in the group was Barbara Dilley and David Gordon had very different tastes in music. And David said, I don't want to dance to that crap that she puts on. And she would say, I don't want to dance to the music that David and Douglas just put in the record player. I mean, those choices of music really tore them apart.
I should mention there's a playlist in the appendix of the book where you've made an attempt using Shazam to capture as much of the
Yes.
music as possible.
Yes. And the music is the reason why you could never have a documentary or film because you'd have music rights for everything. Almost. I mean, there were a lot of moments of silence, but you have Cat Stevens and Dylan and the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, and that.
Yeah, that's interesting. There's a documentary. I don't even know if it's in print anymore, but it was part of the Great Performances series, and I first saw it when I was in college a long time ago. But it's called Beyond the Mainstream, and it features this features the 4, right? So Yvonne, Trisha, David, Steve, but also Laura Dean's in there. K2K is in there.
And they have a little section on Grand Union too.
But there's no music. There's absolutely, there's music to works by Trisha Brown's company. So there's whatever the Grateful Dead accumulation piece is, that music plays in there. But other than that,
Uncle
you don't
Tom's
actually
Band.
hear any of the music that they were using at that time. I'm assuming
Yeah.
because of rights issues.
Yeah.
And this was something that was made in like 82 or something like that. Yeah.
And Barbara Dilley, when the Stones came on at the station or something, I don't know. She would just she's standing on top of a chair and just like the sexiest, I can't even imitate, but like just a hair away from being lewd, and just she's on this chair and it's so like onanistic or something, and they're just watching her like, there's Barbara doing her thing, Actually, they had during that moment, there would be these plans, and they had planned to pick each person up in their chair and move the chair and put it down. And Barbara was standing in the chair. I think she was also tempting them, like, this is going to be hard for you because I'm moving on the chair, and you have to pick up the chair and put me somewhere. She knew what was going on, and they had to pick her up and move her, put her. And by that time, she was like leaning way back. So it became this thing that was just a task dance, became this challenge like, oh my God, how do we move her in the chair? And she's like arching way back. So they would tempt each other in these ways that were just like, you couldn't believe it, how they would tempt each other.
Yeah. I think we have time for one more question. Oh, that's a great question. I would like to know this too. Did their friendships survive their working environments together?
And it's even Trisha and David Gordon and Douglas Dunn were all in the same building. After some number of years, there was very little to, I think it was a co-op,
Wait, they all lived in the same building?
Yeah,
For
and
how
Lucinda,
long?
and Lucinda
How
too.
long?
Oh, decades. Yeah.
Well, I guess if you find a good
541
apartment, why would you leave?
Yeah, 541 Broadway. These were loft buildings. Well, and this I go into in the book in the chapter on Soho. George Machunas, who was this wild man Fluxus person, had a vision of Soho as an artist colony. And what he would do is, and at that time, the manufacturers were leaving the lofts in Soho. So he would buy up a manufacturing place and then sell it to an artist. And then he found 541 Broadway, and he called up Trisha Brown and he said, "There's no pillars here. This is for you."
Oh.
And so she bought it, and I think she had to call David Gordon and say, "Could you loan me the money to buy this thing? And by the way, the fourth floor is empty. Will you do that?" So it was Trisha, David Gordon, Lucinda Childs, and Douglas Dunn were in the same building. Next door was Francis Alenikoff, Simone Forti, people. Who was the musician with the long thing? Yoshi Wada was in the building next door. And Joan Jonas was in the back. So these two buildings were like the pillars of Soho. So it was a little close quarters for the people who, and I know that Trisha wanted to leave Grand Union because she didn't have any control at all. And now looking back, like 40 years later, I can see the things that Trisha had us do that were sort of from the Grand Union. But Yvonne is actually still talking to everyone. She really is, and she has this acceptance of everyone that she worked with, and but their relationships have changed, and it was working with Yvonne that created the bond between them, and you're right, as that was happening, she was starting to make films. So she was really more invested in filmmaking, and she was, if you don't know, Yvonne Rainer was a foremost experimental feminist filmmaker.
So you said you wanted to say something about the Doris Duke Theater.
Yes. 35 years ago, Yoshiko Chuma, who is here, and I shared a program in the Ted Shawn Theater, in the big theater. We were sort of experimental choices because we were downtown experimental choreographers, and that isn't usually what would attract an audience in the Ted Shawn Theater. So we did it for a whole week, and I had 22 pigeons, and Yoshiko had Lenny Pickett and a great music band, and we had almost no audience. So at the end of that, Sam Miller, who was the managing business person at the time, sort of number two to Liz Thompson, he said to me, "Wendy, I want to build a smaller theater for work like yours and Yoshiko's, so that the experimental work would have a place at Jacob's Pillow." And so I'm feeling today like full circle, because that theater was so important, and maybe someday Yoshiko and I will come back and be in the new Duke Theater.
Yes.
But she's here today.
Well, I want to thank you, Wendy, for coming out here and sharing your book with us and sharing your stories with us. As I mentioned, we're going to send you a link to where you can get the book. I encourage you to buy from your local independent bookseller. Any last thoughts you want to leave us with before we wrap it up?
I guess, I wrote a book on this, so I could talk about it for ages.
Sure.
But I was happy to do a book that was about a collective rather than one artist. And these artists were very much battling against hierarchies that exist in the dance world and the world in general. And it did come at a time when a lot of people were anti-Vietnam. And so I feel good that I focused on defocusing, really, and valuing a group of people rather than one single artist. And it's amazing to me what Grand Union accomplished as a collective, that it was like democracy taken to another level. and that could happen in the art world.
Yeah. Well, thank you. If we can get a round of applause for Wendy. Thank you.
Thank you, Melanie.